Hello, 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 and welcome to the Middle Cut podcast. As always, I am your host, Matt Healy, and I am delighted to be joined by the lovely Matt Ella, Mr. Matt Jones, the whiskey nerd. How are you doing today, Matt?
Doing very well. It is a fantastic looking day, so looking forward to what should be a nice conversation and a very good weekend.
Absolutely lovely and warm. Just turning up with a few little bits of audio here. But as always, this is the Middle Cut podcast, which is a part of Potstilled Radio. You can check out more information on potstilled.com or check us out on any of the social media feeds. I am delighted to be welcoming a brand new sponsor to the show, which is W.D. O'Connell Whiskey Merchants, one of the finest independent bottlers in Ireland, but now also one of the most premium whiskey bottlers as well. So if you have any bottling needs for your Irish whiskey, spirits, brands, do check out W.D. O'Connell Whiskey Merchants. So I think we are going to have a good show. Matt, yourself and myself have been talking about a lot of different topics over the last little while. We have been talking about Whiskey Live. We've been talking about a few other bits about the industry, but now we're going to be looking as the industry rolls into possibly a big new period, which is going to be what appears to be an impending consumer consultation process, which is a very sexy word, about the Irish whiskey technical file and specifically about the definition of single pot still Irish whiskey. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I hope you're excited because
I'm
this
very
could be
excited.
a very big turning
I
point
love a
for the
good
industry.
consumer consultation. Nothing gets you more excited than a consumer consultation.
Exactly. Well, I know it's not possibly one of the most sexiest of topics for a podcast, but it is a very important one. When it comes to this, we'll go through it a little bit later on, but this is where the consumers of the world, of Irish whiskey world, will need to have their voices heard. Change probably isn't going to come without the consultation and the opinions of consumers, which is a very big backstory. But basically, in 2021, the industry came together with two different kind of lobbying groups, the Irish Whiskey Association and the Craft Whiskey Guild, and essentially applied to the government to change the technical file definition of pot still from its current, which is 5% other grains, to a more historically correct 30% other grains. The department's had objections. The department's had its own kind of opinions on it. I'm not really sure where their opinions came from, but one thing is for sure that they're now apparently going to public consultation soon. They've said it within the next month. That's not a very specific time period. They've said within the next month a couple of times, but I'm not on the inside track, but I am on the outside track to bring you what information we do have and tell you to use your consumer voice, because this change won't happen without the people of the consumers of the industry having their say. And of course, as the actual date gets announced, we will also keep you informed of that. But it is very important because the change the industry wants to see happen won't happen without people actually rallying behind it.
And it is an important topic. I mean, obviously, it's whiskey. We all kind of are familiar with the idea of pot still whiskey, but like the change to the technical file is kind of. I always feel it's kind of important because it sets what is the geographical indication, the GI of a product, and that kind of it lends legitimacy, it lends like realism and trust in the consumers that what they're getting is what they're actually going to get. Because like there's, as you've heard, the controversies about Japanese whiskey, where some distilleries were just importing whiskey from Scotland, blending it on site, and then calling it Japanese whiskey. That kind of damaged trust in the industry. So it's important that consumers input in and have good kind of feedback into the consultation, so then the technical file comes out well, and we have a good definition of what pot still whiskey is, recognized in the history, and getting a reliable product out there that consumers then can trust is going to be a good whiskey at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, if we go into the grassroots of it, a GI is a geographic indication. It's essentially what the EU uses to protect different food stuffs around the world and their traditional ways of being made. And that is something that comes down to it also, is to recognize the reputation that comes with the place, how it's made, traditional practices, how it's made, and also that reputation that comes with it of that kind of place. For those that aren't familiar with GIs, a really easy example often made by people is champagne. Can't be made outside of the Champagne region in France because that is where it has a reputation of quality production, and that's why the GI is located to that region of France. But it is a long changing process. It has been in the works for quite a while. It all kind of boils down to the technical file and the definition there within. Matt, are you up to date on your technical file?
I'm not 100%. I know what the details in it are, but the actual legislation, the actual backing of the technical file, I don't have all that information to hand. But it's I do know that kind of the core definitions of what is the pot still. Again, even me as a person saying we should have input into it, it is one of those things that I think can get left behind where you focus on what is the whiskey, what is the casks. Like at the end of the day, getting that legitimacy. And so you might, if there's any secrets in there in the technical file, you might share them.
Well, I mean, technical file, or the EU calls them product specification sheets. They're just a big lengthy document saying what is Irish whiskey. It's essentially an opt-in document rather than an opt-out document. If you meet the criteria set within, then you can call yourself Irish whiskey. The base terms for Irish whiskey are very simple. They're also what are set out in the Irish Whiskey Act of 1980. Essentially, grain distillate made with grains, yeast, water, aged for a minimum of 3 years in wood, made on the island of Ireland, matured on the island of Ireland. That's the base definition of whiskey. What this public consultation period is all around is not anything to do with base definitions. It's about one of the subcategories, which is single pot still Irish whiskey. And within the Irish Whiskey Technical File, it says a couple of things. One, it says that the single pot still category is going to be defined as a minimum of 30% malted barley, a minimum of 30% unmalted barley, and a maximum of 5% other grains, or what they also note as adjunct grains, such as wheat, oats, and rye. But at the moment, the current definition is not tied to that. You can use, no one has, but you can use anything else if you want to use millet, or if you want to use sorghum, or if you want to use rice. You could make a Irish whiskey, single pot still Irish whiskey with rice if you wanted to. And that's why, and essentially the argument from the Irish Whiskey Association and the Whiskey Guild, which is pretty unanimous across the board of the people in the industry, is that it is not historically accurate. And that's why they want it to be changed, that this was written and it was essentially written at a time when people weren't focusing on single pot still whiskey, and does not reflect any of the history over the minimum, at least the last 200 years, as to what single pot still whiskey is. And even by the definitions and consumer understandings of single pot still, it doesn't lend itself to that either, because the often cited in the technical file, but also in consumer marketing, is that pot still is oily and thick and viscous and spicy, and those things are exemplified with the addition of adjunct grains, both anecdotally but also the Irish whiskey in-house phenomenon that is Fionnán O'Connor has also outlined this through both sensory analysis with 27 master blenders and distillers across the country, but also through gas chromatography. That the more the adjuncts you add in the categories of wheat, oats, and rye lend themselves to these oily distillates, and spirits that are just malted and unmalted barley actually don't trend as close to the characteristics that define it. They actually go much closer towards floral and sweet, which are, by the technical file's definition, you're into the world of malt whiskey at that point. So it's almost the more the adjuncts lead more to the pot still flavors than otherwise.
So I remember talking to Michael Walsh up at Boan, who he worked with Fionnán, and actually distilling those kind of some of those historical mash bills. The way he explained it as well is that it's not just about you can add 5 or 6% oats and 5 or 6% rye. It's also when you add in, like, say, 10% rye, you're also making sure there's less malted barley, there's less unmalted barley in there, and then the chemical interaction between the grains will change. It's not just adding 5%; it's also taking away 5% of something else. So it changes the way things work in the fermentation, and then down into the distillation. Then obviously Fanon with his gas chromatography, something I've never experienced doing or actually seeing anyone do it. But in terms of the chemical reaction is very important. Something that they probably weren't doing gas chromatography 5, 6, 700 years ago. But when we look at the historical mash bills, we look at the kind of descriptions of the flavors and the tastes and the profiles of those whiskies, like you can actually see that it should be more spicy, and how you get that is by working and kind of experimenting with the grains, and that's what they're doing now with a lot of the distilleries. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, they definitely weren't doing gas or liquid chromatography a couple hundred years ago, but it is great to see that I suppose the department I had their concerns about the organoleptic flavor of single pot still Irish whiskey, and whether or not that would be corrupted by the addition of these other grains. It seems to be. I'm not on the IWA. I didn't speak to the department directly, but that seems to be from a couple of sources what their chief concern was. Thankfully, Fanon with the guys in Boam have a huge battery of information that has gone through chemical analysis as well as sensory analysis with these master blenders, and it brings it to the point that they are organoleptically much closer to what consumers expect, as well as what the technical file actually defines it as, which is quite good. And it also lends itself back to the farmers as well. This gives another crop, especially for instead of cover crops that'll be just sown or plowed back into the ground in the wintertime. This gives options at that point as well. For more biodiversity as well, and stopping, kind of eradicating some of those problems with monocultures, and essentially at that point bringing other income variables as well. If this is a part of Irish whiskey production going forward, we'll need much larger quantities of certain quality grains, and we'll have another avenue of income for the farmers. There's a cost to sowing cover crops, but there's also a cost to maintaining these other grains if they are to harvest them. So obviously it has to be financially viable for them, but of course if it is, that just brings another income stream for the tillage farmers of Ireland.
Yeah, because when Powers brought out their Powers rye, they actually, I wouldn't say they made a big to do about the fact that it was locally grown Irish rye, because Irish rye isn't a thing. They specially commissioned rye to be grown in, I think it was at the Cooney farm near the Middleton distillery, and the idea because they couldn't get rye in Ireland because it's not grown here, and historically we would have been growing rye. So we, as you said, get the biodiversity in there, get different crops going through the rotation, having the ability not just to grow something to then just till it back into the soil to use it as silage, but actually have something that can be used in whiskey production or in food production or other avenues going forward. There's more benefits than just for whiskey production.
Yeah, I mean, and as well in terms of benefits, still on the tillage side, the government has its climate action plan for 2030 and is trying to increase the total tillage land from, I think, 360,000 hectares to 400,000 hectares. And I think it's one of those things that, well, first of all, there was a report yesterday, and Varadkar came out yesterday and said we're missing all of our climate. Every single sector of the economy is missing its climate action targets. But people aren't going to convert fallow land or dairy or beef land used to tillage if there isn't a market there, if there isn't already something that there's somewhere they can bring these grains to. So this again has has a couple of folds of avenues bring, if this 30% adjunct grains are available to distillers, you have that market developing within Ireland for the adjunct grains. If you look at the guys up in Dundalk, County Louth, you've Loughran's Malt and Loughran's Farms. They grow loads of these specialty grains for the Irish whiskey industry, and they're on top of it from their early adapters. So they're growing oats, they're growing rye, they're growing wheat, and they're growing different varieties, because you've got, if you speak to, I suppose, any of the American distillers or any of the kind of more maverick Irish whiskey distillers, there's foaming rye and non-foaming rye, which also has its own issues. So they're working on different varietals to see in terms of foaming and flavor. So there's a lot of experimentation going on. But as I said, the Loughran's guys are definitely ahead of the curve, getting in on this level, and sorting the grain, drying it, and in certain cases malting it as well, bagging it, and getting it delivered to distilleries. So there is a market for it at 5%, but a small market. It's where we're going to see this experimentation and historical accuracy is with this period of consultation, if we get it passed.
Yeah, and it's like it's when you think about like the flavors of the grains, like obviously, like it's important to remember like there are flavors that come from the grains that will come through the whiskey, and it's not like it's just going to be a free for all, and the category of pot still whiskey is just going to be blown open wide, and it's going to be like a million different varieties. Like obviously, some distilleries are going to hit on some mash bills that are going to work well. I mean, when you look at bourbon, it's minimum 50% corn, and then they can use other grains, and there's generally like, oh, it'll be 51% corn, 12% malted barley, 10% rye. There's a few kind of almost set mash bills that work, and it's not a thing where you're going to have one distillery making pot still that's different here, one distillery there, one distillery there. It'll end up, there will be a bit of a period of experimentation, and they will find good mash bills. It's not like it'll be open season and everything, and we can actually have a lot more kind of variety within the category of pot still whiskey that gives us good flavors rather than just an open field of not making whiskey that is definable or is trustable.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that people will find, like the distillers in the States, which is a great example in terms of the mash bill culture, which would have been abound in Ireland at the time of bourbon being a fledgling spirit, same with rye. But people will find house mash bills. Whiskey is about consistency. Production in the 21st century is finding something that works for you and keeping that consistent, because if someone picks up a bottle in Johannesburg or they pick it up in Seoul, they want to know that if it says O'Doul's Irish whiskey on it, and then you buy it in both locations, it'll taste the same. So if you've got a pot still, one variant, you'll have to produce enough to keep that product consistent while experimenting around it if you so choose. And there'll be lots of distillers that won't have the capacity to use these other grains, and will stick with their 50-50 mash bills or whatever they so choose. It'll just be it's a tapestry of flavor that is both historically accurate, but also incredibly exciting for whiskey drinkers and producers. For distillers, it's a very exciting time to be able to play with these spirits and find out these flavors. Oats, wheat, and rye are the current suggested grains under the 5% rule, but people can use any. As I said, you can use rye or millet or sorghum or whatever. Under the new suggested rule, which is under the consultation in a short period, this will be locked into historically relevant grains, which are oats, wheat, and rye. We didn't have other grains in any meaningful quantities in Irish distilling history. But if you look into Irish distilling history, this 5% idea is a very new creation. Nothing pre-1980, pretty much across the board, falls into this category of the 5%. Nearly, I think, except for one distillery in the late 70s, had a 5% margin, which is, I think, where this rule kind of got based upon. But everyone else would have had a margin of between 7 and 25% grains, with people, a few stragglers up at the top in the 30s and a few at the bottom on the 7. But that was the norm of having these extra grains in the mash bills, and nothing of this period in the 1960s or the 1970s would pass as single pot still today. There's no Bow Street whiskies that are going to be classified as pot still. There's no old Middleton distillery whiskies. There's no Tullamore distilleries whiskey that's going to be classified as pot still. So it really throws in the face of Irish whiskey history to not allow these recipes be used or called under single pot still. And there's been bottlings every decade since the changeover in the 1980s that have what we call non-compliant pot still, which is what people base these assumptions on, of the oiliness and the thick and the viscous and the spicy, is bottlings of old Jameson 7-year-old or locks from the closed distillery. whatever it might be, Willie Napier 44 and the Poe 1951, these big, oily, boisterous spirits. And as I said, when you said at the beginning with GIs, it's about trust and consumer expectation. This is a part of the consumer expectation. We're telling them, both as an industry and an experiential point, that pot still is these big, oily, spicy flavors. And then we give them something that is homogenous and isn't. There is essentially a letdown there, particularly if the consumer can figure it out themselves through research that this other area exists, and less beholden to the fact that we make single pot still Irish whiskey. It comes from Ireland, but that is Irish whiskey is written on the end of that word. Other nations can make pot still, and be the day that the US or Spain, or like myself down in I met a guy in Perpignan making historically rooted mixed mash bill pot still that's 20% oats. These are the day, there'll come a day where he'll be exporting into Ireland a historically accurate single pot still whiskey that will be perfectly fine to be called single pot still whiskey, because it doesn't fall under any GI. It's just a name. He could call it, Big Circus whiskey, as much as he can call it single pot still, because he doesn't have the words Irish whiskey at the end, so it's not protected. It's the same as the States. People have these potentially far more historically accurate and potentially very flavoursome or more flavoursome recipes that they could bring to Ireland and essentially outperform us in our own categories.
Yeah, because it's great to see when you look at, like, if you do ever do like the Middleton Distillery tour, and you see like the old logbooks or some of the old distilleries, they don't count, as you said, like in percentages. They don't count, oh, this is the grain that arrived. They count, oh, the farmer down the road had an extra bit of corn, or extra bit of rye, or extra bit of something, so he gave us an extra bag. And I think that's what Cologne are they're kind of leading some of the charge on, like the idea of you can do a substitution, and that idea that the consumers, what they're used to in historical, in various different flavors, like it would have been bags of grains, it wouldn't have been percentages, it wouldn't have been precise. It would have been the distillery had 4 bags of corn, and this week the farmer had 1 bag of rye, so we gave him a bag of rye and they put it into it. And that's how I think they're doing their mash bill description on their Baron Tool releases. And this idea that historically you would have had this, and historically those recipes would have been brought over to America, teaching people how to make whiskey, and then they may decide to make bourbon instead. But they might decide to make whiskey.
What is bourbon but pot still whiskey made with a different grain?
And as you said, like there are the places over there. There's Oam in Canada who are making whiskey. There's Talnua over in Colorado. There's O'Shaughnessy Distillery with Brian Nation. Like, he could scale up and make historically accurate pot still that is beefy and spicy and oily, but isn't that homogenous product you were saying there. So it is a thing that if you leave it at just the 30 and 5%, like Irish whiskey could end up getting outperformed in its own category, and that's not something I think our native industry would want.
Exactly. Look, my main thing behind this is the current definition is just an embarrassment to the industry, because it doesn't comply with anything, either in our own history or in any of those bottlings I mentioned leading up to now, released every decade. They're, Redbreast from the 80s doesn't comply to single pot still anymore. So this is something that brings us back, gives a better understanding, a better opportunity for consumers and distilleries and producers to bring in all of these different flavors through the different grains. Beside me here, I have a very interesting pot still distillate, or should I say non-compliant pot still distillate from Boan. From memory, I think this was a 2 stacks commission distillate. It is 30% malt, 40% barley, and 30% rye. So this is, that's pushing the upper echelon of the 30% for rye. I'm going to do a little cork test here. Yeah, that's beautiful. But rye in the distillate from Boan has fantastic influence, and it's very impactful even in tiny percentages. I think in their core distillate they use it like 1.25%, and it has a huge impact in tiny quantities like that. But it has these fantastic kind of cured meats, spiced meats, herbal character to it. In funny enough, this is a kind of a half-filled bottle. It's been sitting for a while. It almost has this a very alluring, almost like a milk chocolate aroma to it.
Oh, really?
Which is very interesting. There's a lot going on. It's incredibly creamy and viscous as well. I mean, you're looking at the pot still end, but with that, like you said earlier, when you increase something like rye to 30%, it's the interaction by reducing the rest of what's in the bottle. So if this was a 50-50 mash to begin with, adding in 30% has to come from something else, and that has a huge interaction. But keeping the barley up, you're going to keep that spice and that kind of viscosity in some degree. When you get into oats can kind of go two different directions depending on how you process them. They tend to be very famous for being very creamy, very thick and viscous, but they can also be incredibly sweet, depending on how you process them. The viscosity can be reduced, but the sweetness through the roof, and kind of almost like a icing sugar, even verging into kind of that kind of frosting element, which is phenomenal. And one of the things some distillers are doing at the moment is producing mash bills to fit casks. There's a certain type of cask that they want to lay down. They find, say, 200 of these casks, but they want to have something that's big and dry and kind of, almost a pastry quality, buttery pastry quality to it. And then they put in a load of wheat. Personally, I don't really like the inclusion of wheat in pot still, but that's a personal preference. Just because I don't want to put it in there doesn't mean you or Blackwater or Church of Oak or Sleeve League or whoever else shouldn't have the ability to put it in there.
And it doesn't mean that they can't find, as you said, like with a cask, like it opens up the possibility for experiment. Like a wheated pot still whiskey might not be a thing. Just like wheated bourbon. Wheated bourbon is a thing that some people like, some people don't like. But in America, where they're locked in with virgin oak, Irish whiskey could say, okay, wheated pot still isn't great, but wheated pot still that gets a sherry finish or a marsala, it suddenly gets,
Absolutely. And you can use it for other things as well. Like I mentioned, the rye being very flavorsome in small quantities, the oats can be very sweet or viscous. With the rye, because there's this very kind of buttery, oily, but dry characteristic to it, can be used in small quantities to add body and mouthfeel. So that's always these things you can do with these grains as a combination or as a layering effect. And I think what's funny when listening to some of the complaints of even people in Whiskey Live, a number of people actually came to me and asked me that their fears of pot still changing and the whole industry will come crashing down around their knees if we allow people to distill with oats over 5%. But one of the things I was saying is they're saying it'll change the flavor. It won't taste like pot still. But I mean, at the moment, Two Stacks, to talk about them again, made a peated pot still. It's GI compliant. It's under the 5% limit, but it doesn't taste anything like a pot still you or I know because it's peated through the roof. Cologne are doing peated expressions like that. You can take in chocolate malt or acid malt or crystal malt, and you can completely change how the flavor processes come through, even in the current GI compliant pot still definition. So there's a huge room for that experimentation, but to say that this definition keeps us in one flavor profile for consumers in a shelf position.
And even then, like as you're saying, a lot of distilleries do the 50-50 down the line, but like it does say at the end of the day it's minimum 30% malted, minimum 30% unmalted. So if someone does a 70-30 split and someone else does a 30-70 split, they're already going to taste differently. So like the fear of people saying, oh, it'll taste different, it's already there. And it comes down to distilleries finding profiles that work. And like we said, there will be profiles that don't work when we expand the GI, we allow different grains in. And some distilleries are going to maybe stick to the 50-50 because that's what they like. That's what their profile is. So for those distilleries, they're probably not going to change. They might have an expression that's slightly different, but at the end of the day, it'll come back to there might be a change. There might be new distilleries that come out with new stuff that challenges the profiles in other distilleries and maybe is a better profile. And at the end of the day, what's good is going to stick. it's not going to be a change for the worse. There might be some expressions out there that come out that aren't that great, but what's good will stick, and so it'll only make things better if the distillery tries the new grains, decides they don't like it, they can stick with the 50/50. They don't have to change what's already a tried and tested profile.
Absolutely. So I think this is one of those important points to bring it back to why we're talking about this, and that is this potential, or I suppose indicated, consumer consultation period. Now, one of the things that it's coming from the Department of Agriculture. They want to know what consumers' opinions are on this change. There's a few things that go along with this. The period is going to be announced at some point, supposedly in the next month. Now, that might be 2 months. I'm not really sure. 3 months, who knows? Matt, you know yourself, governmental organizations, not the fastest with moving and shaking. But once it's announced, usually these consultation periods will last for about a month, is the kind of general trend. There's been a few in the Department of Agriculture within kind of the food industry, which, by the way, whiskey falls under food, under all kind of categorizations of EU law. They usually run about a month, but the government gets to decide who the public are. They get to define who the public are. I have investigated this. I haven't had a response from the department, but the lobbying groups that I've spoken to have said the department has defined public as consumers, or has defined consumers as the public. So it's not stakeholders, it's not distillery owners, it's not tillage farmers, it's everyone at the moment. I assume within either the Republic or the island of Ireland. But at that point, it will be very clear once it's announced who has the ability to give their consultation on this. The way it'll be phrased hasn't been set out yet, but most likely what it will be phrased like is going to be essentially a list of the current definition, the proposed amendment, and go. It's going to be kind of a yes or no scenario at that point. And that seems, I'm not infallible. I don't have direct information from the department here, so things can change a little bit, but I'm just trying to outline what it appears is going to be at this point.
Yeah, and when dealing with public consultations, it is important, I think, at the outset to give feedback that is usable. That's, it's like it's all well and good for a consumer to say, back in my day when my grandfather told me about whiskey, if they go into that might end up giving feedback that gets lost. Unfortunately, it could be very valuable, could be very, very true, but it comes out very lost. And like you said, like it might be, here's this, go. What do you think? So I think if someone does want to give feedback, it's always important to kind of set out, I support it, I don't support. Be clear, because when someone is going to be, if there's 100, 1,000, 10,000 responses to this, someone's going to have to collate them and collect them and say who supported, who didn't support. Did they support 30%? Did they support 10%, 5%? What did they support? So I think it's important to kind of, if you want to give a bit of a story, a bit of a color, a bit of a flavor, yes, but also upfront, I think always be very clear with, I support it, I support the new definition, here's the reasons why, and kind of go into I support it for, as we were saying, like crop rotation, biodiversity, historical reasons. I kind of break it down so that if someone's summarizing it, they can say there were 100 responses that mentioned biodiversity. There were 200 responses that said, there were historical reasons for it, and there were 500 reasons that said freedom for expression for distilleries. So they have this idea that they can actually summarize your responses, and then it becomes meaningful feedback that then can impact what happens on the consumers. Because if it's a bit scattershot, the ability of the consumer to actually get meaningful change might be kind of constrained by that.
Exactly. And a reminder that this consultation period is arguing over the definition of a subcategory of Irish whiskey. It's not arguing over all Irish whiskies. It's not arguing any other side points about whether you think all grains have to be Irish, or all water has to be harvested from the moon, or poaching needs to change its technical file. Those are all irrelevant side points that we're not discussing in this consultation period. They can have their own consultation periods. They can have their own day in front of the department. This is specifically the question that's being asked. And it is important to remember that this already has opponents for non-historic reasons, just people that are trying to oppose for the sake of it. So don't think just because it has almost 100% industry support, which you would think as a definition for an industry would be enough for the Department of Agriculture to sign off on, but it clearly isn't. And whoever the opponents of this are clearly loud enough that this has now gone to public consultation, which is should be, say, enough that people do need to get out, get their voice heard, and speak in support of this point, because again, it's not historically relevant. It doesn't comply with any of the pre-1980s that are out there. It constrains the distilleries into this fanciful, like 5% other grains are just pulled out of the air.
Yeah.
It was just a recipe that was left, and they went, yeah, fine, go with that. That was it. If it doesn't give any throwback to any of at least the last 200 years of culinary history within Ireland, distilling history. And it completely eradicates any of the kind of flavor diversity that comes with these grains. It doesn't have a benefit to Irish tillage industry. The tillage industry is already trying to argue with malting groups because malt is a commodity, and it is a commodity, as it doesn't have a specialty use. It doesn't have a premiumization aspect to it, which these other grains would have. And even if you look into other distilling industries like Scotland, the SWA is currently having advisory panel meetings about basically what Ireland is doing. They can see what's going on in the world of single pot still mixed mashes. There's a number of distilleries that have come to me talking about mixed mash bills in Scotland, distilling them through columns, distilling them through pots. One of the things is in Scotland, anything that's not a single malt is single grain, regardless of how you distilled it, if it's a pot or a column. And that's one of the things that they're meeting about, is whether or not they should open up these other categories, because the rest of the world, aka Ireland and people like the US, are getting ahead of them in this innovation period, especially with, if you get into the world of other woods and things like that, that's elsewhere down the line. But this area of mixed mash bill, rye whiskies, oaten whiskies, this is very much a thing that the SWA are keeping an eye on and actively meeting about, because they are seeing the consumer preferences, the flavor benefits that these offer, and they don't want to be left behind. So it's incredibly amazing that we would leave ourselves behind on this.
And unfortunately, it is the conservative do nothing option is the easiest option, because we have a GI, we have something. It is the easier option to say, there wasn't enough feedback, or there were some loud voices that said we shouldn't change it. We'll take a wait and see approach, and that could happen. You could easily see if there's not enough feedback, or if the feedback isn't usable enough, or if the industry participants aren't loud enough. They already are quite loud enough. I mean, some of the guys down in Blackwater are constantly talking about mixed mash bills, but it's very easy. You can see how the conservative do nothing option could end up winning, and then again Irish whiskey just gets left behind, because the SWA are going, new distilleries in America, there's companies in America that are experimenting with cask finishes. Up to now, a bourbon that was finished in a different cask was something that was completely off the wall, bonkers, never tried. And now that's coming on as something that's popular. So Irish whiskey can't just rely on the fact that, we can use different casks anymore.
And this is the thing, that having this diversity sets us above the likes of single malt as well, in that sense, because Scottish distilleries have a 12, a 15, and a 21-year-old whiskey, and all that differentiates those at different ages is just simply the cask maturation. They're the same whiskey 3 times, just different ages. This ability already to have this ability of single pot still and single malt gives us a premiumization and a diversification of flavor. But this addition of up to 30% other grains, which are wheat, oats, and rye in this case, very much sets us apart in the premiumization world and gives us something to stand proudly about, because the world of single malt is very Scotch centric, but the world of single pot still whiskey is an Irish tradition and an Irish invention, and it should be changed in the technical file.
And there's an easy, I think you use what you called earlier, mash bill culture. Like there's this idea that, people can find mash bills that suit them and that they like. And
Yeah.
it is a thing because I talk to a bunch of Americans. I know a bunch of Americans who are into bourbon, and they say, oh, I love the new mash bill here. Or, a few of the distilleries use different mash bills and then they blend them together, but you can buy the individual mash bills if you go to the distillery, and they're like, oh, I really like mash bill A, but I hate mash bill B. They get into it. And consumers nowadays, you've got essentially a supercomputer in your pocket with a mobile phone. You can find out information like that. So if you go to a bar, you can go, oh, what's this mash bill? Great. You can find out information with the whiskey, and consumers are getting more picky. So why do we have the definition that just says, oh, Irish whiskey, it's the same, because everyone goes 50-50. If they have that bit of freedom, they can really get into it. And as you said, the premiumization of Irish whiskey.
Yeah, as I said at the beginning, the inclusion of grains at any level has a bigger impact on the flavor profile than the 5 to 30%. So the 5 to 30% jump in terms of flavor contribution and differentiation is a big factor, but it's not as big as the inclusion of grain in the first place. So the moment you add adjuncts, you get closer to that oilier, creamier, more viscous mouthfeel that we're famous for. So already we're able to see that these grains are doing exactly what the pot still category was built upon. So adding these extra additional 25% being able to be added just brings flavor diversity in that sense, whether it be floral, creamy, sweet. In terms of sweet, you can have multitudes of different types of sweet. Whether it be dry or buttery or flaky pastry qualities or whatever it might be, this is where you've got the innovation abounds. It's not going to, change, the likes of, your Redbreast is going to still be Redbreast.
Yeah.
They're not going to change the Redbreast recipe, But where you are going to see change is going to be, Mickle are going to have their own house mash bill that's based on the topographical grains of the area of Connemara, and that's where you can get into those innovations, And it's funny when you mentioned the mash bills in the States. I'm a big fan of American whiskeys, but wheated bourbon is like my least favorite of the bourbon categories. And it's funny because it kind of trends a little bit to my dislike of wheat in Irish whiskeys. But they're quite different because wheat through a column, like they do in the States, or the bourbons, is really sweet, or it's not really sweet, but it's quite sweet. Whereas wheat through a pot is very dry and it's almost like a unsweetened, unsalted pastry flake, like just like pastry crust, quite buttery, but just very dry and kind of almost powdery in that sense. So it's interesting to see even how they're prepared in the bourbon industry. You can use both pots and columns for that category. Irish whiskey, you will have to use the pot that the category is named after. But I think it is that innovation that comes through here is where we're going to put a flag or a mark in the sand, a line in the sand, to show the kind of rebirth of this industry. There's a huge amount of money being put into marketing and category development here. So with this is going to give us something to stand apart and stand out on. There's already distilleries making non-compliant pot still, mixed mash bill pot still is just what I call it. And they will release it. They'll release it as Irish whiskey, and it'll be more confusing to the consumer. This absolutely banging, incredibly complex whiskey that's phenomenally filled with flavors. And they go, "What is it?" And you go, "Well, it's 6% oats." Yeah, so I can't call it. So it's Irish whiskey.
It is pot still if you go back in the day,
and that's what consumers will be able to find out, that it is compliant until 19 whatever, the definition was written in 2014. Just because one company, whatever, no one was paying attention to the writing of the file, and that's what we ended up with. But as you said, people have supercomputers in their pockets, and they'll be able to find out that the industry has left itself behind, much in the same way that the Japanese industry had its own identity issues. And I think this is going to be something that we need to fix now and grow and thrive. Because as I've said a number of times, we're not in a renaissance of Irish whiskey. We're not in the the rebirth of Irish whiskey. We are in the fledgling walking stages. The renaissance and rebirth is coming, and the boom is coming, in my opinion. We haven't hit it yet, but I think it's going to be something that's going to be absolutely laden with pot still whiskey.
Fingers crossed. And fingers crossed it gets called pot still whiskey. It's not the wink and the nudge that it is pot still. If you look the other way, if you squint at it, it's pot still. Exactly, yeah, because there is demand. Consumers care about it. Consumers like the history. Like, one of the big selling points, a whiskey is more than marketing. Obviously, it is history, it is culture. But one of the selling points for a lot of distilleries is how old they are, how historic they are. But they're not following historical mash bills, and that lends that sense of authenticity, and it does help the idea of the rebirth of Irish whiskey. I mean, it's not the birth of Irish whiskey, it's the rebirth of Irish whiskey, the rediscovery of older mash bills, of historical ways of distilling that we did here. And that's not going to be complete until we actually are distilling stuff that we used to distill.
Exactly, and calling it single pot still.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you another little cork pop just because I love it. It's a great sound. This again is that 30% rye. Absolutely phenomenal nose on this. And again, it's very interesting, milky, very viscous, creamy quality to it. But I think that might have to do a little bit about sitting in the bottle. Because rye, exactly, a bit of oxygen interacting with it.
And every time you open that bottle, you get more oxygen in.
I know, but I'm enjoying a lot more. As I said, I've shook it up now. A lot of that rye spice has come back. A lot of that herbaceousness, and I always think of almost a cured meats esque, like someone's having like kind of almost like a pastrami sandwich or something. Really interesting grain, and I think particularly the guys in Boan and any of the independent bottlers who are out there sourcing their own custom distillates are going to see a very big differentiation point as we come into as you said, Blackwater. Peter Mulryan just wrote a fantastic article in a Scotch publication about how barley is essentially a commodity grain, and everyone's forgotten about all these other grains, such as wheat, oats, rye, and maize or corn. If you want to read that, it's a really interesting read. I have posted on Pot Still's Facebook. You can check out that read. What Peter Mulryan's doing, really, really great mash bills and a lot of very big flavor investigations down in Blackwater. Of course, Brendan in Cologne is looking at historic recipes as well as pioneering for himself.
Making his own, yeah.
Exactly, and I don't think that anyone's going to question his legitimacy, no matter what he put, whether he has 1 bag or 6 bags of rye in his distillate at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But again, just to, I suppose, summate, this public consultation period is coming. We will give you a heads up about it, more so in the coming weeks as time goes on. Do get out, make sure your voice is heard. Remember, the point that we are essentially arguing is the definition of pot still as it has been proposed, which is to constrain the grains to just oats, wheat, and rye, which is historically accurate for Irish whiskey distilling, and then to increase the adjunct grains or other grains allowance up to 30% to have this called as single pot still whiskey, which is accurate historically for over 200 years. And it very much reflects what the category could be, but also traditionally is it expected to be also. And a very big thank you to
email. That's the kind of email that, like, at the end, it is a customer preference. It's not a lengthy form. You don't have to go anywhere to fill it. That could be an email that takes you 5 minutes to write, less than 5 minutes to write. Just say, I support it. I support the new definition. It's a good idea. Do it. Or you can get into the long spiel, or you can explain why you support it. But at the end of the day, it's one of those things that, like I was saying, the conservative do nothing option is very easy. So unless consumers get their voices heard, they're not going to be heard.
Exactly. And there will be oppositions to this. So don't think that it's going to skip through and pass without any issue. If you do want to get more information on the changes to single pot still or the original, I suppose, history that informed the submission, kind of fondly is known as 30 malt barley, and then a maximum of 30 adjunct grains. You can check out the articles on potstill.com. Go to that search bar and type in single pot still. You'll find all of the supporting articles that were back in 2021, and then also some more current articles about the upcoming change. Links abound, or directly message me, email me, DM, Instagram, Twitter, whatever you feel like, and we'll be able to get you those articles. If you want to inform your whiskey group or your local pub or whoever it might be, this is a call to arms to spread the word, because this is our opportunity as consumers, industry enthusiasts, whiskey imbibers, and distillery lovers, to get out and get this law changed.
Because there won't be another opportunity for a long time.
Most likely not. No. Very much going to be a one-shot deal here. But a very big thank you to you, Matt, to everyone who is at home listening in, and of course to our brand new sponsors, WD O'Connell Whiskey Merchants, phenomenal independent bottlers and whiskey merchants who have now opened up their own bottling facility in Waterford. So you go check them out at WD O'Connell Whiskey Merchants if you want some fantastic whiskey, if you need a bottling partner. Get in, have a look on their socials. You can check out the whole bottling facility. Dahi, the owner, walks you through what they've set up down there, as well as their phenomenal site that they're located on in terms of whiskey maturation. But also, Dahi has patented a load of new technology and new ways of operating a bottling hall, which has been actually adopted by the people that commission and build these bottling facilities. So definitely want to check out. It's a very cool setup, and we'll be talking to him in the future. But until then, Matt, thank you very much. To you at home, thank you very much. And we'll see you the next time. Thank you for listening to The Middle Cut from Pot Still Radio.
Bye.